Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and welcome to this week's question and answer discussion about ADHD, about the videos I released this week, and about mental health in general. A reminder that the comments I make here should be taken as general information, not as specific medical recommendations, since I haven't evaluated any of you. As Max has already noted in the chat, I'm sorry for last week where the internet I'm dependent on Starlink. I'm here in rural Hawaii, and I've already, in the previous hour, gotten one flash that the connection was unstable. That may happen again. I will try to stay on as long as possible, and if the video is gone, I'll still try to type out answers. And also, I noticed Max has included the link to, so 3 weeks from now on August 26th, instead of the question and answer at this very same time, I will be part of Attitude Magazine's webinar, and the topic is medications, mostly stimulant oriented for ADHD. It should be a pragmatic oriented, hopefully factually based presentation. So you're welcome to that. That's free as far as I can tell. They encourage people to sign up ahead of time, but I think you can also just check in when it's going on. So that's in 3 weeks. So I'll summarize the 2 videos that were released this past week, and then we'll jump into Q&A, and I see there's plenty of questions already. So the 2 videos were on lion's mane mushrooms. That was the new one, and a sound improved version of the mitochondria for ADHD talk. So the topic of lion's mane is one of the hot topics on people trying to improve their brain health and function. It's probably the question I got most input to people suggesting I should talk about it. There is a wealth of basic science, both animal and sort of tissue information, that extracts or components of lion's mane mushroom can help with boosting brain nerve growth factor, brain-derived nerve growth factor, can strengthen mitochondrial function, can preserve neural longevity and functioning, can have some antioxidative properties. So there's good basic science rationale to think this might be good for people's brains. One of the difficulties is that with any biological product, different people, until there's any standardization, there may be different preparations. So one thing to begin with is biological variability. Studies of the mushroom itself have suggested that different extracts may be or different pieces of the mushroom in the wild may be as much as 100-fold stronger with certain bioactive chemicals as other pieces. Whether the individuals are collecting just the fruiting bodies, what we call the mushroom part, or the mycelium, the underground network of hyphae, which are mushroom roots. There's different distributions of chemicals there. With lion's mane, there's at least 20 different what are called aracinones. I might have butchered that, compounds, and there's another class of compounds which may have biological activity or appear to. So it can be hard comparing one extract to another. If someone doesn't get a positive response from one, it might not be that it's lion's mane. It might be that it wasn't purified the right way or targeting the right component. But the actual human data regarding mental health and cognitive health is extremely weak. So there's 2 studies looking in depression, not very rigorously done or very large, barely 100 people in the 2 studies, suggesting improvements in mood and anxiety and improvement in sleep. And there's 3 studies, 2 in people who are already somewhere on the dementia spectrum, 1 on healthy aging people, where on some measures of decreased executive function, decreased cognitive function. Lion's mane had some protective effect in all three of those studies. There were other measures that were looked at that didn't appear any different between the placebo groups. These were placebo controlled studies. And again, with the cognitive domain, there were just barely over 100 patients in the three studies put together. So again, that doesn't disprove it's going to be helpful, but which compounds within it, how they're prepared, maybe combinations of compounds, that remains to be elucidated what's really helpful for people. The other video this was a re-release, was on mitochondria and ADHD, and Chris Palmer, a Harvard psychiatrist. I think it's Harvard. It's either Harvard or Yale. So if I got it wrong, please correct me. So prominent schools psychiatrist wrote a book a few years ago about mitochondria being the contributing or central factor for all mental health conditions. I think in my mind, there's a better correlation that so whether this is a cause of mental health problems or whether this is just a common pathway for brains that are working suboptimally. And particularly with ADHD, there is a dearth of evidence showing a causative role. But again, there are some signs indicating as a group, people with ADHD do seem to have decreased functions on some measures of mitochondrial activity. That's what I will say there. And without further ado, I see there's a wealth of questions, and I will try to get through as many while I still have an internet connection. So hello and welcome, Dylan, who has questions about pregabalin and gabapentin. So that would be Neurontin, Lyrica in the US are the brand names, and ADHD. I am not aware of any rigorous, any studies at all looking at Lyrica and gabapentin or pregabalin and ADHD. His specific focus is whether it can help with people who have anxiety as well as ADHD. And the hope is that it might have some effects on reducing glutamate. So what I'll say is, one is, and this goes back 20 plus years, in the US, the manufacturers of gabapentin were the first in the mental health world company slapped by the FDA with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for promoting gabapentin for uses beyond which it was FDA approved. And they were promoting it for anxiety, for bipolar disorder, for a whole host of conditions 20 years ago. Based on very little data, much of the data since then has been quite equivocal. So my own personal bias is to treat many claims about gabapentin as exaggerated. Is that fair? No, it's not fair. We should wait till the data comes out. So gabapentin appears to be having more direct actions on the GABA system, but that does interact with the glutamate system. It actually depends where in the brain you're looking. So it can boost glutamate in some areas, decrease in others. So whether it's comparable to glutamate more directly and MDA acting agents like memantine or amantadine is, I'd say, a little questionable. I don't know of any reason it would be bad to try, other than its commonest side effect is it can be sedating. So I've certainly interacted with patients who felt that it helped with their anxiety. Again, the data overall with gabapentin and anxiety is one, not extensive, and two, fairly mixed. But that doesn't mean individuals may not. There certainly could be individuals who substantially benefit from it. So my summary there was, I can't identify clear reasons not to try it in general. Again, this is not a specific recommendation, but no evidence that I'm aware of direct benefit in the context of anxiety in the setting of ADHD. So Max is commenting that the internet connection might be bad. Thanks. Um, Looking at questions by James Alexander, which seem to have disappeared. So I'm sure James will send them if, again, or reframe them if for whatever reason. So hello, Dennis. Dennis asks, if a patient is showing treatment resistance to depression, is it a good idea to check their TSH and B12 levels? So yes. So I tend to be on the so my basic premise, and I think there is actually substantial data to support this, is that an extensive history taking, careful asking about symptoms for depression or for ADHD or whatever we're dealing with in mental health, and with detailed follow up depending on what the person's acknowledging or not, including a thorough review of systems. So, looking at what's going on with the person's body as well, usually gives you much more pertinent information than throwing a bunch of drawing blood and getting a bunch of lab tests. I know increasingly there's the inclination, particularly among younger psychiatrists, is let's just get a bunch of lab tests and not think about it. And we're overwhelmed by results that are sitting in files that no one's even really looked at. Anyway, I don't routinely get a bunch of lab tests on someone showing up for the first time with depression unless they have physical signs that indicate there might be problems. On the other hand, absolutely, if someone is not responding to medications for depression, then it's a good idea to check thyroid TSH and thyroid hormone, B12 levels, other B vitamins, vitamin D would also be a good one to check. Even general um, measures of anemia would be useful. And I'll cite sort of the literature for vitamin D since I was looking into it a little while ago. There's very good evidence that just routinely giving everyone with depression vitamin D pills doesn't do any good. On the other hand, in this subset of people who have depression and have low vitamin D, delivering vitamin D has an antidepressant effect. So there are certainly a multitude of physical conditions that you can either contribute to, exacerbate, or maybe even cause depression that if you treat, then your depression will improve. So that's all I'm seeing right now. Sometimes I see there's at least a handful of you out there. I'll welcome any questions or comments. I'm trying to think of any follow-up or specifics on mitochondria or lion's mane that I can add in right now. Um, I guess I should also check. I'm not getting any sign that the connection's bad. So what else can I say about lion's mane? Um, One is it does seem to have a number of compounds that are not found in other mushrooms. So clearly it is not closely genetically related to psilocybin mushrooms, which are a class of mushrooms. So this goes without saying, given that some mushrooms are deadly poisonous and many aren't, that all mushrooms are not the same. And again, there seem to be a wealth of compounds in lion's mane that are not found in many other mushrooms. There's also a fairly well-established, ongoing now for 30 years, lion's mane, cultured lion's mane industry. And there's at least 3 separate ways of cultivating lion's mane. The most like the wild is using some lion's mane usually grows on the trunk of trees, not on the ground. So using logs of ash or birch or other trees that the lion's mane likes as a way of cultivating them. There's also artificial, essentially logs or medium using sawdust and other compounds. One of the questions or worries there is, are you more likely to get heavy metal contaminants if you're using wood that's been treated with arsenic or that has concentrations of cadmium, arsenic, other heavy metals? That mushrooms are good at picking those things up. And there are also ways of cultivating sort of in a completely sort of hydroponic for mushroom culture where you're essentially just growing mats of mycelium, no fruiting bodies. But there are liquid cultures of lion's mane that are also in commercial production right now. Um, so again, if you didn't get responses to lion's mane and you're wedded to wanting to try it again, I mean, it might make sense to try a different preparation. Still not seeing any. I guess maybe it's worth soliciting. uh, Am I still coming through and are people still hearing me? Okay, now I'm seeing a whole flood of things coming in, so I don't know what was going on there. Actually, it's some that were. So James Alexander had asked about, and this he retracted, so maybe he doesn't want to hear the answer. Some claims that antidepressants have neuroprotective properties. Should ADHD patients consider taking, should or reconsider taking SNRIs like Strattera or Qelbree, being worried about increased dementia risk from insomnia and lower sleep quality? Um, so I would say what the data suggest here. So we have two competing factors. There's some good laboratory data that a multitude of antidepressants, SSRIs and SNRIs, have been looked at most closely, promote brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor, promote nerve cell growth in the hippocampus, which is important for memory, and have neuroprotective effects. And there's pretty good clinical evidence from a multitude of sources suggesting, specifically just looking grossly at hippocampal size, the longer people have been on antidepressants of these classes, the greater the preservation of hippocampal size. So there's not just lab bench, but there's actually physiologic suggestive evidence. On the other hand, we know that poor sleep is a risk factor. Nobody has nailed down that it is a causative factor. The association is clear, robust, and strong, looking at it a multitude of ways. There's a lot of suspicion that sleep deprivation has a um, direct role. I mean, partly that tied to the lymphatic system and the glymphatic system being turned on, one, only at nighttime, and two, only on non-REM stages of sleep at nighttime. I think I got that right. So there's a circadian anti-sleep factor, and clearly the glymphatic system is responsible for flushing out um, some of the detrimental amyloid plaque and tau tangle problems. So the question is, are medicines like our antidepressants having a worse effect or a better effect? And I would say the data right now does not suggest that being on these medications long term is a contributory factor for developing dementia, whereas depression itself does seem to be. So I would, not to say we shouldn't keep evaluating and pay attention to it, but I would discourage stopping medications purely for that, for the reason that there might be a negative impact on sleep. So the other thing is just subjectively, even though on some EEG measures, and most of these are done with short-term acute exposure to the agents, there can be some sleep REM suppression and other problems from certain classes of antidepressants. It's less clear what the overall impact, particularly long term, is on sleep. And subjectively, given, I mean, what the underlying factor is that in at least 2/3 of people who have depression, sleep itself is a central symptom of there's problematic sleep and disruption of sleep. So even if you're giving medications which have some risk for worsening sleep, overall sleep is better for depressed people. Sleep on an antidepressant for almost every agent is better than not sleeping and being depressed. That's where I would say the data is right now. Um, so Max forwarded a Reddit question by Significant Club. Is the hippocampus involved in ADHD? Given that the hippocampus is strongly involved in memory consolidation and memory, other aspects, and memory issues and access to memory and storage of memory are impaired in ADHD, just at that oversimplified level, I would say yes. So my thrust of my attention is focusing on prefrontal cortex. So there's certainly other areas, basal ganglia, cerebellum, that are impacted or altered at a group level in ADHD. But the brain is a complicated, interactive, messy system. So James Alexander is referring to questions I got asked before. So Disoxin, which is methamphetamine, which is a legally, at least in the US, it's a legal stimulant to use for ADHD. It's actually, I don't think the FDA indication is for ADHD. I have to double check on that. But it can be used. I use sparingly because, again, there are a wealth of epidemiologic and laboratory data suggesting meth is more likely than amphetamine. And I do have a video on the difference between meth and dextroamphetamine. So the addition of a methyl group makes us um, more prone to addiction, more prone to abuse. So he's asking, I guess, clinically, what made me assess that they were more dependent on their medication, just their own statements of and reluctance to try anything else, or their frantic thoughts on if the pharmacy didn't have it in stock or couldn't get it available. So some of those views and attitudes I see with other stimulants, but I mean, it's hard to generalize from a small sample size, but these individuals were very fixated that this was the only thing that worked for them and that that's what they needed. Sorry, so Max is recommending I speak into the microphone better. So hopefully I will be clearer in any responses now. So Michael said, I read that vegetable oils have too much omega-6 compared to omega-3s, and this imbalance causes a lot of health problems. Should I restrict my consumption of vegetable oils? And particularly the buzzword that I'm seeing a lot of in the last year or two is seed oils are bad for you. So I do have a talk on omega-3 fatty acids. So that might be useful for more in-depth. So yes, there's very good both archaeological and cross-cultural anthropologic data that normal human diets had roughly equal amounts of omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids. So the omega is just telling the location in these long fatty acids where there is a double bond, and that location of the double bond affects the flexibility and other physiologic characteristics of the fatty acids. So fatty acids are involved in a couple things. One is they are a major component of all cell membranes, including brain cell membranes. And this is a case of you are what you eat. So the proportion of omega-3s to 6s in your diet is reflected in the proportion of omega-3s to 6s in your cell membranes. And there's a little bit of data indicating that specific neurotransmitter receptors do behave differently if they are sitting in an omega-3 rich nerve cell membrane versus an omega-6 cell rich cell membrane. Another thing that happens to omega-3s or 6s is that they're converted into certain prostaglandins, which are not exactly hormones, but they're messenger chemicals, and the omega-6s generally are forming prostaglandins that are pro-inflammatory, that ramp up the inflammatory system, and the omega-3s are not cutting it off, but more regulating or dampening it down. So there's good evidence, again, with inflammation and a host of mental health conditions. So there's good reason, yes, to think that having too much omega-6 relative to omega-3 has health consequences, including mental health consequences. What's particularly bizarre to me is that there are some supplements out there that are giving you, and that almost all modern diets are rich in omega-6s, because so much of what's sort of hidden, is the safflower oil, the corn oil, the cottonseed oil, all these oils that are rich in 6s. About the only commonly available oils that are rich in omega-3s would be walnut oil and avocado oil. And those are not major, they're much more expensive. So I think so yes, diet does have some effect here, and most of us are getting more omega-6s and 3s in our diets. So consciously trying to minimize some sources of excessive 6 and taking sources of omega-3. So the major omega-3s are DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, and EPA, icosapentaenoic acid. There will not be a spelling test on this. Another good source of omega-3s is flaxseed, but the flaxseed is alpha-linoleic acid, which does take several more steps to be built into the EPA and the DHA, which are the forms that most mammals use. So taking probably omega-3 from fish oil supplements may be more helpful than flax oil. James Alexander asks, what are the most severe examples of positive illusory bias that you have observed in your ADHD patients? So to review, I do have a video on positive illusory bias. So positive illusory bias describes, and it was mostly described in children and mostly boys with ADHD, but as many as a third of boys have an excessive confidence in their own or overestimation of their own abilities. I should point out that the baseline is most kids do over exaggerate their own abilities to begin with. So we tend not to be accurate observers of ourselves and or tend to overinflate our own self-worth, but this is to a greater extent in positive illusory bias. Two, it seems also unlike normal overinflated assessments that if you get corrective evidence, if you think, well, I'm the fastest runner in the third grade class, and then 3 girls race past you, then you might think, oh, well, I'm pretty good. I just had a bad day. You adjust your thinking. In positive illusory bias, it seems relatively impervious to positive or to feedback to the contrary. The other thing is, in general, having a positive assessment of your own abilities increases the motivation to work harder. So if you think you're good at math and you're struggling with a math problem, a reminder or telling yourself, I'm good at math, I can get this, is associated with greater persistence. This is in physical and mental tasks. But the examples with positive illusory bias in a few studies, they didn't find that these kids worked harder to achieve their goals. They're just like, I'm going to be okay with this and I don't need to work hard. People hate it when I get into politics, but I would say the number one example I would give of this is a certain person who's president of the United States right now. And again, the overlap between what's narcissism and what's positive illusory bias, we could get into that, but I would say at some simple level, he meets the full criteria for positive illusory bias in terms of having wildly inflated assessments of his own abilities, including handling the economy. When he is handed information that refutes that, it does not register. No, you just fire the statistician in charge. You don't acknowledge there might be some valid information there. And does it actually make him work harder, think more? No, he just doubles down and does what he does before. In terms of clinical patients I've worked directly with, um, I'm thinking of people where the positive illusory. So one is I don't work with children, so I'm working mostly with adults. And there again, it's really hard to know. So one is nobody's ever done the studies. Is positive illusory bias a predisposing factor for narcissism? Is it actually just a manifestation of narcissistic personality traits in youth? Usually we don't identify personality disorders till late adolescence or early adulthood. Um, so the individuals I can think of most closely, it's hard to know what was narcissism, what's positive illusory bias, or what's even psychosis in some who, particularly with amphetamine induced, but other psychotic disorders, were overinflating their self value. So Peter Dragon, which is an interesting name to be going into different mushrooms. And I'm sorry, things are jumping around. Says on Reddit, at least, there's a specific anti-lion's mane crowd. There's talk about rather unpleasant psychic symptoms like brain fog, mood swings, etc. Any specific knowledge, data on this? So interestingly, when I was reading, virtually all the published research would throw in a few paragraphs of how free of any adverse effects, that maybe a few people had stomach aches, but this was well tolerated. Again, this is a mushroom that is a common food, not just a nutraceutical source. So lots of people have eaten lots of lion's mane. But I did, in the comments to my video, have one person describe very explicitly some initial positive benefits and then more extensive brain fog, mood swings. So other than that specific comment to my video, I don't have data. And with anything on the internet, we're not looking at random sampling, so it's hard to know how prevalent bad effects to lion's mane are. We know people who are likely to have either extremely good or extremely bad reactions are more predisposed to write about it and share about it. So again, the value of that is that at least at an anecdotal level, this is in the range of possible reactions. That's good to be aware of. But in terms of assessing, is this particularly common or not? The vehemence or strength of people posting gives you no indication of how common this is. And again, very clearly, given that there are no standardized um, procedures, protocols for purifying it, or even just for drying it or dehydrating it, and that there's a wide range in concentration of different I'm going to put active components. One person's lion's mane extract or preparation may be radically different than someone else's. So it could be contaminants. It could be you don't even know that you're really getting lion's mane. There could be other factors involved. That's what I'll say there. So Michael asked, so James Alexander asks, should the average ADHD patient be worried about having enough raw materials in their body for dopamine synthesis when taking stimulants? Some ADHD patients claim you should take protein shakes. Um, Two things. One is, again, I'm tend to be, as I am, minimalist about getting lots of lab tests. I'd say most people on a generally healthy diet are getting enough of the nutrients. So backing up a further step, there's very little evidence that deficits in dopamine synthesis are primarily responsible for problems with ADHD or for problems with not getting benefits from stimulants when taking them. There may be other abnormalities of the dopamine system or reuptake or regulation or transport or even receptors. But having a shortage of dopamine synthesis generally doesn't seem to be the issue. Um, that doesn't mean it can't in some cases. So the video I'll be hopefully recording in the next day or two is on iron. There is some evidence, at least in some kids, iron deficiency, and iron is a essential cofactor for tyrosine hydroxylase, which converts tryptophan to L-DOPA, which is one step away from making dopamine and two steps away from making norepinephrine. So there are probably some scenarios where deficits in raw materials may contribute to neurotransmitter synthesis. But in one of my other talks, I mean, usually there's not a strong connection between, and I've just brought up one exception with omega 3 fatty acids. I mean, partly because of everything you eat isn't just absorbed 100%. Everything that's absorbed, or many of the things that are absorbed, are broken down into smaller components. So just taking a precursor seldom is a good way to boost levels. That doesn't, and again, even if it's a direct precursor, even if it's well absorbed, even if it isn't broken down, even if it gets into the nerves, so it has to cross the blood barrier as well, unless it's part of the rate limiting step, just providing more of the precursor does not make more of the final product. And the analogy there is the assembly line one. So, say you are not getting enough Teslas off the assembly line because your, I don't call it the moonroof, but your windshield that goes from the windshield over half the top, you're a shortage of supply there. But you're frustrated, you want more cars coming off the assembly line and bringing in more chassis, which, yes, is the chassis an important part of making the car? Yes. But if that's not what's limiting output, then bringing in a whole bunch of chassis just means you will have a pileup of chassis in the assembly line. It won't give you more output at the end of the line. Dennis is mentioning that some mushrooms are grown in tunnels. I'm glad people can hear me. Yeah, I don't know more about the mushroom cultivation than beyond what I was saying. So Significant Club asks, how can I learn better as an adult? So that's a fairly broad question. And again, maybe I shouldn't be making recommendations behaviorally as well as not medication wise. I think the cognitive behavioral approaches to ADHD can be helpful. I mean, one is just getting rid of distractions in the workspace. Two is learning what channels of information processing are good for you. Is it auditory? Is it pictorial? Is it listening at twice the speed? Is it listening at half the speed? Is it taking notes afterwards or summarizing a written article or dictating into your microphone afterwards. So learning what your own strengths are. There are clear evidence that things like concentration time and ability to focus on work can, even if by biology you are at one end of the spectrum, biology never dictates one point on a spectrum. It might push you towards one end of the range, but even if you move from one end of your range to the higher end of the range, you're doing better. The other big thing I would say with ADHD is ADHD brains tend to be interest driven rather than importance driven. So, trying to find ways to make whatever you have to learn interesting. And I think the good thing is with nonlinear thinking, there's almost always ways to convince yourself or to find a hook that makes X, Y, or Z interesting for you. Mr. AKA asks, do my ADHD patients have poor posture? And I think I'm better than some of my peers at noting and attending body posture. And I can't say, I mean, particularly since I think both depression and anxiety have a strong impact on body posture and positioning and how you think of yourself. So I don't know that I've identified worse posture or a particular problematic posture among ADHD individuals. Um, and I don't know how much that's been looked at, but it's a really good and interesting question. Sorry, I don't have something more concrete there. So some of these questions are coming up from last week. That's fine. So I'm happy to answer them out loud. I wrote some. So James asks, when would I say that the ADHD patients most incorrectly? So what are the situations where patients perceived that I was unjustly, unfair, judgmental, firm, or strict with them, even though I was just looking out for their best interests? And my answer to that was I might even be considered laissez faire. So I think my job is to explain options, explain the good and the bad, and to not let my own biases intrude as much in terms of the decision making process. So, one is I am cited much more often as, Doc, tell me what to do. Don't just give me the evidence. What would you do rather than. But the one situation where consistently I'm judged as unfair or judgmental are people who've had amphetamine induced psychosis. And my reading of the literature and my view of patients is that even if you've had one single episode of amphetamine induced psychosis, you should never be on an amphetamine product again. And even if you had psychosis from a different cause, so you had marijuana induced psychosis or a PTSD induced psychosis, I would be very reluctant to prescribe, particularly amphetamine and maybe any stimulant. Again, whether Ritalin a stimulant, we can get into that. So I've had patients who were not happy with that and decided not to continue with me because of that. I think I was acting out in their best interest. They didn't. Are there other things I've withheld or been uncomfortable writing for? I'd say benzodiazepines I'm not a big fan of. I have had some that they worked well and for decades or who are on a combination of stimulants and benzos. So that's what I can say there. So I think I had answered Dylan's question about pregabalin, gabapentin, neurontin in relation to ADHD. So again, particularly if someone has not responded to alpha-2 agents and or propranolol, my other two thoughts probably is at least as likely as gabapentin to to help with anxiety in that setting would be SSRIs or buspirone. I do have a talk on buspirone and ADHD and on this channel. Um, Both of those, though, are you're taking them regularly, and the virtue of gabapentin is that they can be taken on an as-needed basis. Um, so again, I'm not aware of any rigorous studies on gabapentin in the setting of ADHD. Um, I'm, and again, its effects on glutamate are variable depending on what brain region you're looking at. So thanks, Max has included the link to the positive illusory bias video. It's one of my older ones. So as a clinician, what are the traits, attitudes, or behaviors not specific to ADHD among your ADHD patients that frustrate, annoy you the most? I'd say there's probably a difference as to what frustrated me in the first years and later on. So, I mean, one is I think I'm pretty articulate in describing benefits and downsides of different options. I pretty clear that I am clear when I give a patient instructions as to what the plan is. I even fairly often write things down. And yet, for many ADHD patients, they would wind up taking twice as many pills or split the dosage up or not split it up or just not follow what they seem to be aware of and agreeing to in the session. And I'd say over time, I've just much more comfortable that this is highly likely to be happening and to not. I think I'll back up even further, and this is a good thing to know about anxiety. I think most of the time that we get angry at others, we're at least partly angry at ourselves. So part of the anger at, that clinicians have at patients is when they don't follow directions. I mean, it's twofold. One is, I think, underlying worry, did I tell them wrong? Did I do something wrong myself? Two is believing that what I told the patient is the best for their health, and they're undermining that. So that feels unfair as well. Um, but I think being able to accept this is part of the territory. It's not about me or how good a job I can do, and I can again maybe more consistently write things out. But that still doesn't always work. Um, what other things are annoying? I'd say now that I'm completely web based, I mean, when I was there in person, there would be more missed appointments. Um, that again, I mean, I could always find something useful to do with my time, but it's difficult not knowing whether someone's not going to show up at all or just going to be 5, 10, or 30 minutes late. Blue Bassett asks, can modafinil be good for brain fog sluggishness, or would guanfacine be a better choice for this? Also, any tips for success in my organic chemistry 2 class? The first one was super difficult. Um, so lots of good questions. I do have a video on modafinil. Modafinil is good at helping with alertness. Again, so one big difference is with modafinil, not that there might not be some cumulative benefit, but most of what you're going to see is what you get. So if you're not seeing any improvement on a given dose and you're not having side effects, it might make sense to try a higher dose. But if you're not seeing much immediately, it's not likely to. Guanfacine's benefits more likely to be slow and gradual. Um, I think there are likely to be people who would benefit from either, and there are certainly going to be people who would benefit from one and not the other. So, in terms of better choice, that would probably depend more on other individual characteristics of your situation that I'm not privy to. And tips for making organic chemistry more successful. Again, sort of overall good study habits. being vigilant and regular and staying with it, because lots of organic chemistry builds upon itself. That's almost upon there. Or so staying abreast, staying current rather than letting things pile up. And again, anything you can do to make it fun. That might be building 3D models of what's going on, or watching videos that are colorful and interesting rather than the book, or other finding tie-ins of taking 2 minutes to figure out something interesting about what any of these chemicals are. Keith asks Focalin versus Concerta as a non-amphetamine option. So for years, and this is a gross generalization, Concerta was, from what I could see, the Ritalin formulation with the highest rate of success and the lowest rate of problems. I certainly have had people on Focalin who felt that it worked well for them and continued to do so, but usually Concerta was my go-to. The big issue in the last decade with Concerta is that many of the generics are pretty different than Concerta. So some of the advantages of Concerta have been sacrificed in some of those. So I think there's something missing from James Alexander's question about breaking down of catecholamines and the same amount of free radicals. So one piece there that I would say is that even if you had the same amount or number of free radicals at the end of the day, how much they're flooding the system at any moment, so their distribution may well be very important to their toxicity. So it's more sort of the problems with excitotoxicity is how much is flooding at any one moment and overrunning the normal electron sopping up and other capabilities of the body. Michael asks, are turmeric and ginger good for ADHD? And I think data is extremely limited on either. I haven't had patients proclaiming dramatic improvements with either of those, but those are good topics to look into, so I'll make a note. And I'm looking at, I'll try to race through what's left a little more quickly. Mr. AKA says, evening Dex sometimes worsens ADHD symptoms, even contributing to a fender bender. My theory was neurons were depleted of dopamine, so dextrine was causing norepinephrine dominant effects. L-tyrosine seemed to fix this. It sounds plausible. And I'm glad you found something that fixed it. That's what I'll say there. Thanks, Max, for providing the link to the buspirone video. So James Alexander asks, have I had ADHD patients who denied having any given NPD symptom when explicitly asked about them individually, yet still give off clues they had NPD? If so, how have you been able to coax them to divulge enough information to make a definitive diagnosis? I'm not remembering that scenario coming up specifically. And I would say more often I have the opposite. I have people who've, particularly spouses or others, have told them that they were narcissists. And yet ADHD seemed to be a more accurate and pervasive explanation for behavior. And again, if you are in a relationship with someone where you are feeling neglected, you are feeling your needs aren't being met, you can decide that's not good enough for you, whether it's coming out of narcissism or whether it's coming from ADHD. So I'm not minimizing people deciding that they're not getting what they need out of in a relationship or getting what they don't need, but jumping to the conclusion or creating the storyline that the person's doing it because they're a narcissist. What I tell people is usually you're on better grounds just describing the behavior than deciding that you know what the motivation is. And that might sound funny, given that a lot of my work is sorting out what the motivation is for things. But so often I've seen, I'm thinking of a patient who was, 2 hours late for his wife's birthday dinner and then made up a lie that they both knew was wrong, that he got stuck in traffic and she felt it was narcissistic. And yet, earlier that day, he had been planning of showing up, and it was in the moment he got stuck with work and was late. And did he make bad choices once he was aware that he was late in terms of acknowledging it? But part of why he didn't was because he knew no matter how he framed it, she would take it as an insult and a hurt. And again, there's a valid reason she would feel hurt. But again, whether that's narcissism or whether that's ADHD, to me, it looked more like ADHD. So Katia, so that's Mr. Cupcake in the chair there. He's 14 and showing his age more there, but I'm glad he's appreciated. So Mr. AKA is responding to James. He began taking 600 milligrams L-tyrosine at the start of lunch break, and then taking his evening dextrine dose at the end. And that seemed to help with crashing at the end of the day and being worse focused. Thanks, Max, for providing modafinil video. And Dennis says just that organic chemistry 1 was easier than organic chemistry 2. So, and yes, D3R, yes, D3R gets lion's mane, can be bought from powder form. And again, I'm glad you got good results from powder, but again, specific compounds can vary by as much as 100-fold in one fresh mushroom from another to another. So unless there's some substantial quality control, one person's powdered mushroom, powdered lion's mane may be substantially different from another part. Blue Bassett asks, what do I think of mirtazapine as a sleep aid? I've read some people think it's an antidepressant. In fact, it's due mainly to its ability to REM sleep. If so, why is it so infrequently used for this? So mirtazapine, Remeron in the US is a antidepressant. So it's in a class by itself. So part of it is, why is it used so infrequently? Doctors are comfortable with SSRIs. Doctors, lump things into classes and then are less well acquainted with any of the outliers or things that don't fit into simple categories. So one is, it doesn't fit into a simple category. Two, there's 2 really common side effects with mirtazapine. One is that almost everyone does sleep more deeply. Some people are too sedated by it, feel groggy the next morning. That's a minority, but it's a substantial minority. So anyone who wants to feel alert and awake might be resistant to taking it, even though, again, it does seem for many to be a restful, positive sleep. 2 is that the other common side effect is about 20% of people have a substantial increase in appetite, and it can be actually feel uncontrollable. I've had nurses and doctors who had to put locks on their cabinets, otherwise they'd be snacking late at night, and that's associated with weight gain. And in my experience, at least 80% of people are convinced they're going to be in the 20% that gain weight. So once you mention that's a possibility. People are averse to taking it. But yes, I've certainly had people who either came to me or we started mirtazapine. Usually it's lower doses. Usually it's 7.5 to 15. Antidepressant range tends to be in the 15 to 60 milligram range. Using it for sleep. There's also one other sort of paradoxical thing. So mirtazapine has some noradrenergic activating properties. So there are some people who feel revved up for a more quickly than they do from sedated from it. So they'll feel revved up for an hour or two and then feel sedated. So warning people of that. And there are also a number of people, as they change the dosage, have relatively different, um, if I'm remembering correctly, some of the sleep effects are histamine effects, antihistamine effects, relatively different effects as they go through the dosage. So some people who weren't revved up before do as they get to a higher dose. So it switches from being helpful for sleep to not being helpful. Some respond the other way, where at the low dose it revved them up and it doesn't at all on a higher dose. So it's a little trickier in terms of expectations there. Um, so I think it looks like our time's up. So thanks for the great questions today. Thanks for sticking with me. It doesn't look like Starlink crashed, so that's good. Thanks for not just asking questions, but being willing to share personal history. So thanking Mr. AKA and others today who did that. And I will be back next 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks from now, I'll be on the ADHD webinar, Attitude Magazine webinar. Stay healthy, stay happy, and have a good week. It's not ending proper there.